All right, so we're talking about reabsorption along the kidney tubules. And so our diagram shows the glomerulus here where filtration takes place. So all of the filtrate ends up in the tubular lumen. So this is the tubular lumen. And these are illustrations of 4 different proximal convoluted tubule cells, simplified. And so next to that you have the interstitium, and then over here you've got the peritubular capillaries. So we are focusing on 4 items that get reabsorbed along the renal tubule: sodium ions, chloride ions, glucose, and water. Looking at how each of these ions or substances gets moved across the renal tubule will do 2 things. One, we'll review some concepts that we talked about previously, which include active transport, the sodium-potassium pump, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So we've talked about those things before. And the other thing that it's going to do is it's going to show you the direction of the process and where the kidney is expending some energy. So the kidney is highly metabolic. This organ is highly metabolic because it has to invest energy in the process of reabsorption and the process of secretion, which we'll talk about later. So if we start with sodium, sodium really drives the reabsorption of these other 3 items, of chloride, of glucose, and of water. So first we need to understand how sodium moves across the tubule. So within the apical surface of the tubule cells, you have sodium ion channels that sodium can easily move through and into the cell. Once it gets into the cell, on this basolateral membrane, which is the side of the cell that is communicating with the interstitium, you have the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, which we've talked about before with respect to nerve impulse conduction and other processes. So the sodium-potassium ATPase pump uses ATP to pull 3 sodium ions out of the cell, and at the same time it moves 2 potassium ions into the cell. Potassium tends to leak out, so it's kind of going in and out here as this pump is working, but this is how we set up a gradient for sodium ions. So this cell is depleting the interior of sodium, which drives the reabsorption on the tubular lumen side. Sodium moves into the cell, then it actively gets pumped into the interstitium. Okay? As those sodium ions build up in the interstitium, it sets up conditions for chloride ions to move passively. So either chloride will move passively with sodium through those sodium channels, or it will move between the cells passively and accumulate here in the interstitium along with the sodium ions. So regardless of which of these mechanisms chloride uses, there is no expenditure of energy. Okay, so now we have set up a nice sodium chloride filled interstitium that of course is going to set up the conditions for water reabsorption. So water moves by osmosis through water channels that are called aquaporins. So these represent aquaporins, and as sodium chloride builds up, water moves by osmosis through these pores and into the interstitium to be with sodium chloride, because the concentration gradient drives the reabsorption of water. Finally, we have the reabsorption of glucose. Glucose reabsorption occurs both actively and passively. So the active part of glucose reabsorption is that glucose reabsorption is tied to sodium, so glucose will move through an ion channel that uses ATP to pump sodium ions, and glucose moves with the sodium, and this kind of ion channel is called a SIM port. A SIM port is going to accomplish the process that we described as co-transport, where you're moving 2 things in the same direction. So just like along the digestive tract with the intestines, we moved sodium and glucose together and we absorb them. We do the same thing during reabsorption in the kidney tubules. So ATP is used for this. Glucose and sodium move into the cell, and then glucose moves on the basolateral surface by facilitated diffusion, which does not require energy, into the interstitium. All right, so this is how these 4 items are reabsorbed. We have every kind of transport process represented here. We have active transport of sodium. We have passive transport of chloride ions. We have active and passive transport for glucose. And then we have passive osmosis of water. Okay? Once all those end up in the interstitium, they very quickly move into the peritubular capillaries, and now they have been reclaimed.